Spring 2001, in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, Wanda Sizemore couldn't understand what her goats were doing. For 6 straight mornings, the same 4 goats ignored the clover growing across the hillside, ignored the patches of fresh grass scattered between the trees, and walked straight toward the same wall of poison ivy, climbing over what looked like nothing more than an old pile of rocks. At first, she assumed they'd found younger vines and would move on once they finished browsing, just as they always had. Instead, they returned to that exact spot every morning, stripping away more of the vines until the first corner of a carefully stacked stone wall slowly appeared beneath the leaves. The next morning, more of the wall emerged. A day later, the outline of a narrow doorway began taking shape where Wanda had always believed there was only rock and brush. Curious now, she pushed through the last curtain of poison ivy and stepped toward the opening. Before she could see what was hidden inside, a faint sound drifted through the cool air, and she stopped without taking another step. Somewhere behind those old stone walls, water was still running. As you listen to this story, pay close attention to why those goats refused to leave that one patch of poison ivy, because what they uncovered behind those stones would end up changing far more than the hillside itself. 3 weeks earlier, Wanda's life had been revolving around a very different clock. Her husband, Earl, had suffered a stroke while repairing equipment in the tractor shed behind their home. He survived, but after emergency treatment, he was transferred to a skilled nursing facility to begin rehabilitation, where every day became a careful balance between hard work and hope. Wanda quickly discovered that the real deadline wasn't Earl's therapy schedule, but Medicare's benefit period. The first 20 days of his care were fully covered, but once day 21 arrived, daily coinsurance began eating away at savings that had never been especially deep. Unless something changed before day 100, the coverage would end completely, leaving them responsible for costs they had no realistic way of paying. That same week, 72 neglected acres came up for a county tax auction. The opening bid was $1, and not a single person raised a hand against her. Most of the property was buried beneath poison ivy, brush, and decades of neglect, so overgrown that even people familiar with the mountain avoided walking across it. Wanda didn't buy the land because she believed it was hiding something valuable. She bought it because, with time slipping away, it represented one more chance to fight for a future she refused to surrender. The first person she told was her longtime neighbor, Dewey Napier, who had spent most of his life clearing hillsides throughout those mountains. He listened quietly before shaking his head and explaining that goats truly did eat poison ivy, but clearing it was a very different matter. The roots survived beneath the ground, seeds continued sprouting long after the vines disappeared, and anyone hoping to reclaim a mountain usually spent several seasons doing it instead of one. "If you're expecting those goats to finish that mountain this year," he said, "you're fixing to be disappointed." Wanda thanked him and drove home with those words echoing in her mind. If a man who had worked that mountain for 50 years believed time wasn't on her side, she couldn't help wondering whether she had enough of it left to save Earl and the land. Wanda couldn't get Dewey Napier's words out of her mind. She respected his experience too much to dismiss it, and arguing with a man who had spent half a century reclaiming mountain land wasn't going to change the truth. Instead of convincing herself he was wrong, she decided to learn everything she could before spending another dollar she couldn't afford to lose. She began reading about rotational goat grazing, poison ivy management, old springhouses, and every practical way neglected mountain land had ever been turned into productive property. She wasn't searching for hidden treasure. She was simply trying to discover whether those 72 forgotten acres held any honest opportunity at all. As the goats continued working the hillside, they gradually stripped enough poison ivy away to expose more of the old stone structure. Curious about what she had found, Wanda contacted the state extension office, and a few days later a hydrogeologist named Dr. Sarah Kessler drove out to see it for herself. By then enough of the Springhouse had been uncovered to inspect it safely, and after spending several hours examining the site, she performed a series of basic field tests on the water. The results were encouraging, but not extraordinary. The water appeared remarkably clean. The flow remained steady even after several dry days, and the Springhouse itself suggested the spring had once been important enough for someone to build a carefully crafted stone structure around it. Even so, Dr. Kessler refused to promise more than the evidence supported. She explained that mountain springs often produced excellent drinking water without carrying any real commercial value, and determining whether this one was unusually productive would require detailed laboratory testing, geological mapping, long-term flow measurements, and additional investigation. Right now, she told Wanda, all I can honestly tell you is that you found a very healthy spring. Whether it's anything more than that will take time to prove. Wanda thanked her, but the drive home felt heavier than the drive there. If even the experts couldn't yet say whether the spring was worth anything, who else would be willing to believe in it? A few days later, she carried photographs of the Springhouse, copies of Dr. Kessler's preliminary findings, and a folder full of handwritten notes into the local bank, hoping the discovery might be enough to secure a modest operating loan. Roy Bledsoe, the loan officer, studied every page before quietly sliding the file back across his desk. Mrs. Sizemore, he said, I've financed farms on this mountain for nearly 30 years, but I've never written a loan against poison ivy and old stone. He explained that without a professional appraisal or verified commercial value, the bank simply had nothing it could reasonably lend against. If this spring becomes something real, he said, come back. Today, it's still a maybe. The hardest conversation of all came that evening. Renee had driven several hours to visit Earl, and was surprised to learn that her mother had spent most of her free time climbing a mountain instead of sitting beside him at the rehabilitation center. She wasn't angry. She was scared. Mom, she said quietly, Dad needs you right now. I don't want you chasing a piece of land nobody's wanted for 60 years while he's fighting to come home. Wanda didn't argue because she understood exactly what her daughter meant. Renee wasn't criticizing the land. She was afraid of losing her father and couldn't bear the thought of watching her mother lose everything else at the same time. In that moment, Wanda realized this was no longer just a story about reclaiming forgotten property. It was about finding some way to keep Earl home when Medicare's clock finally reached the end. If you've ever had to choose between what everyone else believed was practical and the only opportunity you had left, then you already understand what Wanda was carrying. Stay with this one, because the answer she eventually finds wasn't buried by accident. It had been waiting beneath that hillside all along. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Not long afterward, an elderly neighbor named Garland Meadows slowly drove up the old logging road after hearing rumors that Wanda had uncovered part of an old stone building. He stood quietly beside the Springhouse for several minutes before speaking. My mama used to send me up here with buckets when I was a boy, he said. Folks always said this was the best water on the mountain. He rested his hand against the weathered stone wall and looked toward the hillside. If that's the same spring I remember, he added softly, there may be more history buried up here than most folks ever knew. With that, he climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Wanda with one more mystery to think about. 72 days left. Dewey's warning proved to be exactly right. The first sections the goats appeared to clear began sprouting fresh poison ivy only a few weeks later as surviving roots pushed new shoots back through the soil. Instead of becoming discouraged, Wanda changed her approach. She rotated the herd through the same sections again and again, carefully marking every grazing cycle on a hand-drawn map hanging beside the calendar in her kitchen. Little by little, she learned that reclaiming the hillside wasn't about winning one battle. It was about returning often enough that the poison ivy gradually lost its strength. Before long, every day followed nearly the same routine. She fed and moved the goats before sunrise, drove to Earl's rehabilitation center to encourage him through another day of therapy, then hurried back to the mountain each afternoon to repair fencing, monitor regrowth, and prepare another section of hillside for grazing before darkness settled in. The work was exhausting, but each week the poison ivy surrendered a little more ground than it reclaimed. By the middle of the summer, the change had become impossible to ignore. Stone walls hidden beneath decades of vines emerged farther along the hillside, and the old Springhouse doorway became clearer every time the goats returned to browse the same area. The poison ivy hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in many years, it was no longer winning. The goats never suffered from the poison ivy. Wanda wasn't nearly so fortunate. While repairing a section of fencing coated with fresh vines, she developed a severe rash across both forearms that forced her away from the hillside for several miserable days. Watching the work come to a halt while the Medicare calendar continued moving toward day 100 was almost harder to endure than the itching itself. Around that same time, Earl managed to take his first slow, unsupported steps between the therapy bars. They were only a handful of careful steps, but Wanda watched every one of them with tears in her eyes because they reminded her exactly why she refused to quit. Just as the Springhouse finally became accessible, another problem arrived. Neighbor Dale Ferris filed a formal challenge claiming the spring might draw water from beneath both properties, creating uncertainty over who actually owned the source. Until the question could be settled, no commercial agreement involving the spring could move forward. Suddenly, Wanda found herself racing two deadlines instead of one. Medicare's clock continued counting toward day 100, while every week the water rights dispute remained unresolved, pushed any opportunity the spring might offer farther into the future. The hillside was finally beginning to reveal its secrets. Time, however, was slipping away even faster. 51 days remain. The water rights challenge stopped everything almost overnight. No company was willing to discuss the spring while ownership remained in question. The bank still refused to lend against property tied up in a legal dispute, and every day the paperwork sat unresolved pushed Wanda closer to the moment Medicare would stop paying for Earl's rehabilitation. She had finally uncovered something that might change their future, yet it remained completely beyond her reach. One evening, she sat alone on the worn stone threshold of the Springhouse, listening to clear water flow through a channel that had survived 60 years of neglect without anyone noticing. The sound should have filled her with hope. Instead, it reminded her how little any of it mattered if she couldn't prove the spring belonged to her. For the first time since buying the mountain, she wondered if she had mistaken hope for a plan. Later that evening, she drove to the rehabilitation center and quietly watched Earl struggle through another therapy session. Every careful step demanded everything he had, yet he refused to quit. As she watched him fighting for the life they had built together, Wanda realized she couldn't give up either, even if she had no idea how the story was supposed to end. The next morning, Garland Meadows drove slowly up the mountain carrying a weathered folder that looked almost as old as the Springhouse itself. "I figured somebody might need these someday," he said as he handed it to her. "Just never imagined it'd be you." Inside were copies of the original deed, a hand-drawn boundary survey, faded county tax maps, and handwritten notes showing that the Springhouse had always been recognized as part of the old coffee property. Those forgotten records were combined with a modern boundary survey and updated county property records while, almost at the same time, Dr. Sarah Kessler received the completed laboratory reports, geological mapping, and long-term flow analysis she had been waiting for. Taken together, the evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. The spring appeared to draw from the same regional aquifer supplying two established commercial springs farther north, and its steady flow ranked among the strongest sources Dr. Kessler had evaluated on that section of the mountain. For the first time since Earl's stroke, Wanda wasn't surviving on hope alone. She finally had evidence. The county's review moved far more quickly than anyone expected. Garland's old records matched the modern survey almost perfectly, and when county officials compared the original deed, historical boundary descriptions, tax maps, and the Springhouse's location, every document pointed to the same property line. Rather than spending months in court, the water rights dispute was resolved within weeks, officially recognizing the spring as part of Wanda's land. Only then could she finally ask the question that had been waiting since the goats uncovered the stone doorway. What was the spring actually worth? Dr. Kessler completed the remaining laboratory work and returned with the full report. The water wasn't simply clean. Its flow remained unusually consistent through changing weather conditions, and the geological mapping continued supporting her earlier conclusion that the spring was drawing from the same regional aquifer feeding two well-known commercial springs elsewhere in the region. She also explained that the Springhouse itself may have protected the source for decades by shielding the emergence point from disturbance, allowing the water to remain remarkably stable through years of neglect. The discovery was no longer just interesting. It was becoming important. Rather than making promises, Dr. Kessler shared the completed findings with several colleagues experienced in commercial spring development. A few weeks later, representatives from a regional spring water company contacted Wanda and asked if they could visit the property. They spent most of the day walking the hillside, inspecting the Springhouse, measuring flow, reviewing the laboratory reports, and discussing the long list of environmental approvals, sanitary protections, and permitting requirements that would have to be completed before a single bottle of water could ever be sold. Wanda listened far more than she spoke. Nothing was guaranteed. No one promised quick money. But for the first time since buying the mountain, experienced professionals were discussing her property as though it possessed genuine commercial value instead of forgotten potential. Several weeks later, the company returned with a proposed long-term lease. The agreement included a signing payment of approximately $35,000, followed by projected annual royalties estimated at nearly $65,000 once permitting was completed and production reached expected levels. The money wouldn't begin arriving overnight. The approvals would take time. But for the first time since Earl's stroke, Wanda could see a future measured by something other than deadlines. News of the restored Springhouse spread quickly throughout the county. Before long, members of the local historical society asked to visit the property and explained that the beautifully preserved stone structure might qualify for the Virginia Landmarks Register because of both its age and remarkable condition. They also explained that while historic designation wouldn't automatically create income, it could make the property eligible for heritage tourism, educational programs, guided visits, and small community events once restoration was complete. Only then did Wanda fully understand what those goats had uncovered. They hadn't discovered buried treasure. They had uncovered a forgotten piece of Appalachian history. Season after season, they had simply followed the healthiest poison ivy on the hillside until they revealed a spring that nature had quietly protected beneath 60 years of vines. The answer to the mystery had been there from the very beginning. Those four goats were never searching for something valuable. They were only doing what goats have always done. It was Wanda who stayed curious long enough to follow them. By the time autumn settled across the mountains, Dewey Napier walked the hillside with Wanda for the first time since warning her that one summer would never be enough. He had been right. Patches of poison ivy still clung to the slopes, and fresh shoots continued pushing through the soil where old roots refused to die. Yet the mountain no longer looked the way it had when Wanda first bought it. Repeated grazing had weakened the vines, opened long-hidden stretches of hillside, and uncovered stone walls that no one had seen in decades. Dewey stopped beside one of those walls and looked across the property before quietly smiling. "I still say it'll take another couple of seasons," he admitted, "but I'll also say this. Most folks would have quit after that first regrowth. You didn't." For Wanda, those few words meant far more than hearing she had been right. They meant she had earned the respect of a man whose opinion had mattered from the very beginning. Not long afterward, Dr. Sarah Kessler returned to review the completed laboratory reports, geological studies, and permitting recommendations before the final paperwork moved ahead. She reminded Wanda that her caution had never come from doubt, but from the simple responsibility of following the evidence wherever it led. Standing beside the restored Springhouse, she listened to the steady flow of water for a moment before smiling. "I don't get to say this very often," she said, "but this really is one of the exceptional springs." A week later, Wanda found herself sitting once again across the desk from Roy Bledsoe at the local bank. The office hadn't changed, but the documents resting between them certainly had. Instead of photographs and hopeful notes, the file now contained geological reports, an independent appraisal, and the proposed long-term lease agreement. Roy read through every page before approving a line of credit without hesitation. Wanda couldn't help smiling. "The land didn't change," she said. Roy looked up and nodded. "No," he replied. "We finally understood what it was worth." The apology Wanda treasured most, however, didn't happen on the mountain or at the bank. It happened beside Earl's hospital bed. When the first lease payment arrived, it covered months of his continuing rehabilitation, lifting the fear that had followed the family ever since the stroke. Renee quietly reached over and took her mother's hand. "I thought you were choosing that land instead of Dad," she whispered. "I didn't realize you were trying to save them both." Wanda squeezed her daughter's hand without saying a word because there was nothing left that needed explaining. Before winter arrived, she climbed back to the Springhouse one last time and found Garland Meadows standing quietly beside the old stone doorway. She thanked him for keeping those forgotten records safe all those years and offered to pay him for preserving them. Garland simply smiled and shook his head. "That spring didn't need somebody smarter," he said. "It just needed somebody patient enough to keep looking." A few moments later, he climbed into his old pickup and disappeared down the mountain road as quietly as he had first appeared. By the end of the first year, The 72 acres Wanda had won with a $1 opening bid supported 3 connected opportunities. The long-term Springwater lease provided an immediate signing payment and projected annual royalties once production began. The restored Springhouse became eligible for heritage tourism, educational visits, and small community events through its historic designation. Most importantly, the first lease payment removed the financial panic that had haunted Earl's recovery from the very beginning, allowing his rehabilitation to continue without the fear of running out of options. The same hillside everyone had dismissed finally became the reason Wanda and Earl could begin looking toward the future again. For 60 years, everyone who looked at that mountainside had asked exactly the same question. How do you get rid of all that poison ivy? It seemed like the only question worth asking because the vines covered almost everything worth seeing. They made the hillside look neglected, unusable, and hardly worth climbing. Very few people ever stopped to wonder what all those years of neglect might actually be protecting beneath the surface. The goats weren't searching for buried history. They were simply eating the plants they preferred, following instincts they had no reason to question. Yet by doing exactly what came naturally to them, they slowly uncovered a forgotten springhouse, a protected water source, and a story the mountain had quietly preserved for generations. Wanda didn't succeed because she worked harder than everyone else. She succeeded because she kept paying attention long after most people had already decided there was nothing left worth finding. Sometimes the greatest opportunities aren't hidden because they're impossible to discover. They're hidden because people stop looking the moment the surface appears worthless. 6 months after winning the opening bid on 72 acres almost everyone else had ignored, Wanda stood once again in the doorway of the restored Springhouse. This time Earl stood beside her, leaning comfortably on a cane as clear spring water continued flowing through the same stone channel that had remained hidden beneath poison ivy for 60 years. The hillside hadn't changed because someone forced it to become something different. It changed because someone finally uncovered what had been there all along. If you had been in Wanda's place, with your husband's future depending on what happened next, would you have risked buying those 72 overgrown acres? Or would you have walked away like everyone else? Why? If you enjoy stories about forgotten American land, overlooked opportunities, and remarkable discoveries like this one, subscribe. There are still plenty of forgotten American stories waiting to be told.